Hello and welcome back to An Old Man Watches. This is the first video I'm recording post-Christmas 2023, so for those of you who celebrate the holiday, I hope you had a good one, and for those of you who don't, I hope you had a nice day anyway. Today, I'm going to be talking about the 1974 made-for-television thriller All the Kind Strangers, which you can also find under the title Evil in the Swamp. And the film begins with photojournalist Jimmy Wheeler driving along an isolated back road somewhere in the United States. He comes across a young boy who is walking along the road with a heavy bag of groceries. Since there's nothing for miles around, Jimmy is concerned for the boy and pulls over to speak with him. The golden-haired moppet happily accepts Jimmy's offer of a lift home. Apparently he's never heard of stranger danger, or perhaps it's the adult who should be wary here. Jimmy soon regrets his kind offer as a ride, as the journey takes him deeper and deeper into backwoods country on a much longer diversion than he expected. Still, despite his exasperation with the unexpected delay, he accepts the kid's entreaties to come inside the house and meet the family. A total of 7 children of varying ages from 6 to sort of 16, 17, somewhere around there, and their mother, or at least a woman they call mother. Jimmy's already been told that the young boy's birth mother is deceased. So that's a little odd, but Jimmy doesn't bother to overthink it because he'll be leaving in a few minutes anyway. But wouldn't you know it, after he says his goodbyes, he finds his car won't start. It looks like Jimmy will have to stay for the night, and perhaps a good while longer than that. As you probably guessed from my earlier not-so-subtle foreshadowing, these 7 orphans don't have any plans to let a kind stranger like Jimmy just walk out of their lives. Not when they need good parents to look after them. So I'm not sure what was in the water in the 1970s, but it seems like it was a big decade for movies where travelling to new places, particularly rural places, was a dangerous proposition. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Deliverance, Straw Dogs, and I Spit on Your Grave all date to the early to middle part of this decade, as does this film. Now, this kind of thing certainly wasn't a new genre, of course. The Most Dangerous Game was written in the 1920s and featured an island-dwelling aristocrat with a penchant for hunting humans. And then you have H.P. Lovecraft, where you're pretty sure that any character who wasn't from the big city was in league with inhuman monsters of one kind or another. So there was certainly a history for such fare, but the 70s sure does seem like a peak period for it, with some of the most famous or infamous movies of the form being well remembered even today, and in many cases the subject of sequels, remakes, and sometimes multiple remakes. All the Kind Strangers is not one of those prominent, well-remembered movies, but I don't think that's because it's a bad film. In fact, I think it's a pretty good one, for what it is, which is a television movie. So let's talk about what I liked about it, and also along the way, why I think it lacks the cultural recognition or notoriety of those other films that I mentioned. So All the Kind Strangers was made for US broadcast television in the 1970s, and consequently it had much more stringent content limitations than the cinematic releases I mentioned earlier. Now, I'm not saying that those other movies were only successful and remembered because they could include graphic violence and sexual content. Well, I mean, except for I Spit on Your Grave, which I think was, a bad, very mediocre film that did very much rely on blood and nudity as selling points. But all of those were the kind of movies where words like intense and visceral were applied for them. There's content in Deliverance and in Straw Dogs and in obviously the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. You're not going to get on television, particularly broadcast TV in the 1970s. Now, this movie simply doesn't have the option to portray the same kind of content, and to give credit where credit is due, I think the filmmakers have successfully made a virtue of that limitation. Knowing that they can't have graphic violence, they have leaned into suspense and a sense of menace instead. And despite the apparent goofiness of their premise, a bunch of kids keeping fully grown adults as captives is a pretty hard sell, I think. They've done so quite effectively. The children's numbers advantage is repeatedly illustrated in the visuals. You constantly kind of see, there's a lot of them. And they have on hand some big, well-trained dogs. Having one of those beasts snarling and slavering into the camera is a simple but effective way to sell the idea that nasty things could be about to happen, even if we know in the back of our minds that nasty things will never actually be shown, because television movie. Now, of course, there's an old line about how you should never work with children and animals, and this is a film that does both. But it does so quite successfully. Now, of course, it does cheat a bit, which is why I've put the word kids in quotes. At least 2 of the actors playing the children were actually well into their 20s. John Savage, who plays the eldest of the orphans, was in fact already a father himself by the time this movie was made. Savage's career probably had its greatest success about 5 years after this film, when he won critical acclaim for his supporting performances in Hair and The Deer Hunter. He shows the promise of that future here, believably portraying the role of the eldest orphan and the ringleader of their little parent-snatching operation. A ringleader with secrets even from his siblings, as it happens. Savage would also go on to be a prominent anti-apartheid activist in the 80s and 90s, which, though it's got little bearing on his performance here, speaks well of him as a person. Now, of course, it wouldn't matter how good Savage was if the rest of the performers playing the kids were bad, but they're not. They all give solid performances. I think you have to admit that their job is perhaps made a little bit easier by the fact that when they're being nice and sweet, we're supposed to feel like there's something a little bit off about them. The creepiness that sometimes undermines supposedly cute movie children isn't a problem here because that kind of subtle creepy vibe is actually something that they want to have happen. Now, on the other hand, the younger cast have no such leeway on the performance where the film wants them to be creepy and off-putting. They actually have to sell that. And to their credit, I think they do a fine job of that as well. In large part, I think the film's need for restraint in content helps with that. Having them be more aggressive killer kids would be a more difficult proposition than the lurking, implicitly rather than explicitly threatening tone the movie goes for. So the cast of kids, including ones who really are kids, do a solid job. What about the grown-up roles of Jimmy and Mother? Well, I'm pleased to say that the strong casting work continues with these roles. Stacy Keach plays Jimmy. Keach never became a top film star. His extensive work on television and his decision to turn down the lead role in The Exorcist, probably both being contributors to that. But he's been consistently good in every movie I've seen him in, and he doesn't disappoint here. His Jimmy is bluff and well-meaning, a decent man whose self-confident, uncomplicated view of life blinkers him to his own danger until it's almost, too late. It's not an especially complex role or sort of everyman designed to be easy for male audience members to identify with, but Keach executes it solidly. On the distaff side, we have Samantha Eggar as Carol Ann, the woman the children call Mother. Eggar's another solid performer who never quite broke through to international stardom. In her case, it may have been the role she took rather than the role she turned down that cost her. Her highest profile role was probably that of Emma Fairfax, the female lead in the 1967 offering Dr. Dolittle, which, despite somehow being nominated for the Best Picture Oscar, was both a critical and commercial failure. I haven't seen that film since I was young, but based on her performance here, I'm not inclined to blame Eggers for Dolittle's failure. She has the most difficult and most nuanced role to pull off. Carol Ann has been held by the children for some time and covers her near-panicked fear with a brittle veneer of cheerful domesticity. Eggers captures that slightly manic, if I pretend everything is fine, then maybe it will be, air of desperation very nicely, making obvious to the audience, but not so overselling it that it's too implausible that Jimmy would initially miss it. So yeah, All the Kind Strangers is not a masterpiece by any means, but it's a capably executed, well-judged TV thriller with a much better cast than is usual for this sort of thing. I was pleasantly surprised by it. Next time, not every 1974 TV movie was a good one, as the disappearance of Flight 412 amply demonstrates. But that's next time. Until then, thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you've seen today's movie, let me know what you thought of it.